Stargazing Hill by S.R. Martin. Chapter 3. The shadows had grown long when they finally reached the foot of the lone hill. Only now could they fully comprehend the size of the landmark. While the main group took a rest among the overgrown rocks, Heinrich left his luggage behind and started to round the hill counterclockwise with long, efficient strides, counting for a good path to climb the hill. They did not have to wait long for his return. Soon, his voice called from 30 steps above them, and they looked up to find him waving from a higher ledge. "There's a path running around the hill," he shouted, his hands cupped to his mouth in a funnel to project his voice. "It's just around the corner, less than half a mile." He pointed to the direction he had gone to and waved for them to follow him. Tired, yet invigorated by the thought of finally reaching their destination, the group started out once more and began their ascent. Calling the route that Heinrich had found a path was generous. He climbed back down and met them at the base of the trail so they would not miss it. While it was not very steep, it was in parts barely wide enough for the mules to get through, as it snaked its way through angular rocks. Clearly, no one had set foot on this hill in ages. The path was just as overgrown with moss and grass as the rest of the hill. The stones and boulders of the hill that protruded through the vegetation were weathered with age, overgrown with lichen, moss, and finally grass. Though they were broken and shattered in places, it dawned on the humans who dared to climb this ancient place that was in no form natural. The boulders were angular, and where wind and rain had not allowed vegetation to accumulate, it exposed titanic walls, constructed from giant stone slabs, tall as any man and twice as long, that had been fit together perfectly without mortar. Cat shuddered when they passed through a gap in the rocks that could have once been a gate. "Giants built these walls? I can't believe it." A few steps further, Asteropus spotted something on an overgrown pile of rubble. Excusing herself from her blind teacher, she stepped off to the side, picked up a rock from the ground, and brushed off the moss and earth as she examined it, turning it in her hands. Suddenly, her eyes lit up, and she hurried to return to the front of the group. She sounded excited as she explained to Erika what she had found, and showed it to Heinrich and Lennart. It was a thin piece of stone, almost like a slate, but brighter with a greenish tint. It was also even and smooth, betraying its artificial nature. Lines of fine, angular script were carved into the rock, covering every inch of its surface in dense writing. If this place was built by giants, they must have had tiny hands to carve these fine glyphs, Asterope explained as her teacher let her fingers run over the script. Either that, or they used a magic spell to write this, the master astrologer mused. Maybe they had giant builders, but human scribes, Heinrich added to the speculation. "Whatever it was, we need to find a place to make camp before the sun sets," Lennart said, urging them to get back on track. "You can look at rocks all you want once we've pitched the tents." Soon they reached the top of the hill. It was almost flat and overgrown with thick grass over an area as big as a hamlet. But they didn't spare it more than a curtsy inspection, for the sun was setting, and they did not want to erect their camp on the weather-exposed top of the hill. Instead, they set their tents and cooking fires on several almost level terraces on the leeward side of the hill, where its bulk would shield them from the worst of the wind. Even though the terraces were just as overgrown as the top of the hill, the ground was hard rock after just a hand's width of soil. After breaking half a dozen pegs, they settled on moving heavy rocks into place, securing the tent cords to them. It was hard, laborious work. By the time the sun set, they had only managed to erect the most essential tents. The rest of the camp would have to be set up on the morrow. While the mercenaries erected the tents, Heinrich and Asterope tended to the mules and built a cooking fire. By the time the work of the day was done, everyone was glad to have a bowl of hot soup to soak their hardtack and warm their bellies. When the last bit of color had drained from the horizon, the sky was left a solid black, with only a few tiny stars that had not yet been swallowed by the darkness. Without fanfare, the astrologers left the camp, and Asterope led her teacher up to the top of the hill. Heinrich followed them at a respectful distance. He was curious. He had never seen an astrologer at work, but he also didn't want to disturb them. The moment after the three had left, Cat 2 stood up from the fire and followed them. On the top of the hill, Erica pulled down the hood of her cloak and removed the velvet blindfold from her eyes. She blinked a few times, then turned her sapphire blue eyes towards the sky and stared in open-mouthed wonder. This was what all the work, long travel, and hardship she endured coming here had been for, why she had hidden her eyes from any light for so long. Now the astronomer's study of the stars and their secrets could begin. This first night, Erica only used her eyes, while Asterope applied her small telescope occasionally to look at stars she could not spot with the bare eye pointed out by her teacher. Heinrich watched them quietly from the side, only taking an occasional glance upwards to check if he too could see the wonders of the night. Cat 2 watched the sky, watched the astrologers, especially Asterope, and frowned. Then she watched the white man. After a few minutes, she started shuffling around and fidgeting with the cords of her parrot Jack. Eventually, she bit her lip and whispered to him, "That was impressive, how you spoke to these strange people." He shrugged. "I guess we are as strange to them as they are to us." "You've done something like this before?" "I've been around. Traveled most of the known world, actually. I've met many people who did not speak Ambeki, but the strangest people I've met in the Wurd. Some of them were not human at all, but usually you can communicate somehow." Cat grinned. "With hands and feet if you have to." Heinrich just shrugged once more in reply. "Come on," she said, and tapped him on the arm. "Let's go back to camp. The ladies can find the stars without a scout." That almost made him chuckle, but he suppressed it so it came out as a funny grunt. "Yeah, let's," he said. They returned to the campfire, where Leonard had started assigning the watches. On the next day, the astrologers slept until midday. Heinrich and the mercenaries spent the morning erecting the remaining tents and tarps to shelter their supplies and provide additional protection from the weather. But when the scholars had finished their breakfast, there was a much more delicate construction to be done. The men carried 2 heavy wooden boxes onto the top of the hill. One mule had only been used to carry this special load. One of the boxes contained the largest telescope any of the men had ever seen, though Asterope assured them that it was tiny compared to the stationary telescope that the guild used in their various observatories. It was a marvel of engineering, a thick, dark wooden tube containing the finest lenses and mirrors, held together by brass rings and fittings. The best lens grinders in the known world were members of the Astrologers Guild and worked exclusively for them. The other box held a massive tripod with an intricate positioning mechanism. It had to be put together from several parts and anchored to the ground before the telescope itself could be mounted to it. Asterope had 2 men lift the telescope under his strict supervision and hold it in place while she secured it to its mountings. Once the telescope was erected and calibrated, the astrologers became increasingly nocturnal, studying the stars all night long and sleeping through most of the day. Only during dinner and breakfast did they speak to the other members of the expedition. For the first few days, Heinrich kept watching them during his watches, but returned to the camp sooner and sooner, where he entertained Cat and the other mercenaries with stories from his many travels. To keep his men from becoming unruly due to boredom, Leonard had them fortify the camp as best as they could. With the stone they found on the hill and the wood they had brought, they erected several barriers on the path to the top of the hill. When that was done on the third day, he had them run through drills, train, and spar. All of that was not enough to keep Cat from becoming bored and restless, though. She kept flirting with Asteropa during the early morning and evening when both of them were awake, but the astrologer became more and more irritated as the days passed, and eventually shouted at Cat to leave her in peace. After a week had passed, not only was the atmosphere among the expedition growing tense, but they were also running out of food and firewood. "I have to turn back now and get back to the forest," Leonard protested on the morning of the 8th day of stargazing to Erika. He and Heinrich had pulled her to the side after breakfast, so as not to have the discussion before the rest of the group. But the astrologer shook her head. "I can't stop my studies now. I'm close to breakthrough. This might be the last chance to study these constellations before this world vanishes," she explained. "I won't have my men starve or freeze to death up here," Leonard barked. "I'm paying you a fortune for your services. It's your job to take care of these things," she snapped back at him. "How many more days do you need?" Heinrich asked calmly, stepping between the two. He could feel the scholar staring at him, even though she was wearing her blindfold. But after a moment, she sighed. "Maybe 3 more nights. No more than another week. We could send a detachment to the forest, gather firewood and forage for food. I could put out a few traps and try hunting some larger game," Heinrich offered. Leonard considered this, but frowned and shook his head. "If we split the group, I won't have enough men for a continuous watch." "Just 1 or 2, then? I just need someone to watch the mules and cut firewood while I do the hunting," Heinrich explained. Leonard pondered that, his jaws working. Eventually, he nodded, if reluctantly. "All right, you can take 1, but you better catch something big, or I'm calling this off." Heinrich gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, I'll make sure to keep your men fed." Erika yawned. "Right then, if this is resolved, I'll go back to bed," she said, and brushed the right man on the arm as she left. "I'll leave this in your capable hands." "You can sleep without worry. I got this," he assured her, earning a tired smile and a nod of thanks. Half an hour later, Heinrich was just saddling the mules with their pack saddles when Asteropa approached him, her face shaded by her hood, hiding a long yawn behind her white-gloved hand. "Master Whiteman, when you are in the woods, could you kindly do me a favor? Gather some berries for me," she asked. Heinrich turned from his work to face her and ducked a little to the side to catch a glimpse of her face. Dark rings under her eyes betrayed a continued lack of sleep. "Sure, do you need something to help you sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Well, maybe that too. What I really want you to get me is some deadly nightshade." The white man raised an eyebrow. "What would you need that for? It's poisonous." Asteropa sighed with exasperation. "You can make eye drops from it that help you see in the dark," she explained. "I know," he replied with a frown. "It's still poisonous, though. I take it your observations are not going well." The young astrologer shook her head, and her shoulders slumped. "No, can't even see half of the stars my teacher sees. Feel like I'm no use besides leading her around when she has the blindfold on." Heinrich nodded, slowly. Erika relies on you, but I understand your frustration. I'll see what I can find. Oh, thank you, she sighed in relief. I'll make it up to you. He gave her a dismissive wave. No worries. Go and catch some sleep. You need that far more than medicine to help your studies. Chapter 3. Heinrich held at the edge of the forest clearing, where he and Kat had made their resource-gathering camp. He had spent the day setting traps and hunting for game, and carried the body of a doe over his shoulders. For a moment, he could not help but to take in the sight. Not so much of the camp itself, though the young mercenary had done her work over the day and set it up well. The tent was erected, the mules bound to a tree and fed, and stacks of arm-long firewood were ready to be loaded onto the animals. But what arrested his gaze was the woman herself. She was splitting firewood, stripped down to just her hoses and breast wrap. For a moment he admired the play of her supple muscles of arms and shoulders, her naked back gleaming in the light of the near bonfire. But then she bent down to pick up the wood pieces with deliberately stretched out legs, and his eyes were drawn to her shapely buttocks. Her hose were cut into strips in the fashion favored by the mercenaries of Ambeck, so they would not hinder movement, but they also showed off her well-toned legs through the gaps in the fabric. "See something you like?" she asked pertly, holding the pose for just a moment, then stood up with the firewood in her arms, turned around, and carried it to a pile next to the fire. The white man but glanced at her, then let out a sigh, put down the dough at the edge of the camp, and walked up to the fire, warming his hands. "You made good work on the camp and firewood. If we keep this up, we'll have gathered enough by tomorrow to make our return," he said, acting nonchalantly, as if he had not seen anything out of the ordinary. Kat pouted and studied him as he settled into camp, took a long draught from a waterskin. After this brief moment of rest, he took out a hunting knife and began skinning and butchering his kill. "I hope you like venison," he said, concentrating on his work. "We'll be having it for a while." She clicked her tongue in annoyance and watched him work a moment longer, then pursed her lips and decided to redouble her efforts. She had not traded a bottle of rotgut to get assigned gathering duty and get away from the other mercenaries, to be denied by a reclusive white man. A foxy grin grew on her lips, and she leaned down behind him, looking over his shoulder, and pressed her perky breasts against his back. That got at least a reaction out of him, and his hands stopped moving. "I'm on the mood for sausage, if you catch my drift," she whispered into his ear. Heinrich closed his eyes, drew in a deep breath, let out a longing sigh. "This is not the time for games. Still got work to do. Help me cut this meat if you got nothing else to do," he explains, not annoyed or stern, but making it clear where his priorities lay. Kat grimaced and clicked her tongue again, stifling a curse about boring old forest gnomes as she put on her shirt. But after splitting a dozen more logs for the fire to vent her frustration, she calmed down and joined the white man in his work. Eventually, they had finished the butchering, cut the meat into thin strips, and skewered it on long sticks, ready for smoking in the morning. After cleaning up the camp, they sat in the light of the fire, chewing on freshly grilled strips of venison. "I thought you were into Asterope," Heinrich suddenly remarked, startling Kat. They had barely spoken a word all evening. "I was just playing," she replied after a moment, still chewing, gesticulating with the skewer in her hand. "It's funny to see that bookworm squirm. I don't think she gets much action in the university." Shook her head and chuckled. "It also keeps my comrades from trying to get into my pants. They think I'm only into women." He raised an eyebrow at that explanation. "Isn't that what you want?" She made a dismissive gesture of the skewer and rolled her eyes. Oh, it's exhausting when all of them do it. And the captain once told me never to shit where I eat. Heinrich nodded. Besides, she continued after tearing off another bite of meat, the others are all hopeless braggarts. Barely got any hair on their sacks. The captain is the only one who's got some stories to tell, and he told me not to shit where I eat. So that's how it is, the white man replied, and continued eating without saying anything more. But the conversation had renewed Kat's interest. There was one man who had stories to tell, probably knew his way around a woman. It was the far-travelled white man. She wolfed down the rest of her meat and tossed a skewer into the fire, then stood up, walked over to him, and sat down right on his lap, making him almost choke on his food. She lifted her arms, pressed her chest out, and stretched lasciviously. Say, Heinrich, the work is all done for today, so why don't we relax a little? She suggested, puckering her lips. For a moment, the surprised man did nothing. Then he continued chewing and studied her face and thought. He hesitated, though she could feel his reaction to her advances pressing against her backside. She needed to give him one more push. Are you reserving yourself for that old astrologer? She teased. That one has only eyes for the stars, I'm afraid. No chance there. Eventually, Heinrich swallowed, put an arm around her waist, and sighed. You know, I've learned 2 things in my travels. He threw his own skewer into the fire. The first is never to refuse a free meal. The other is never to push a beautiful woman off your lap, he explained, then pulled her close and kissed her with primal desire. Later that night, when the fire had burned down to nothing but embers, the 2 companions finally settled down, sharing a single bedroll, slowly drowsing into sleep in the afterglow of their love-making. Heinrich suddenly startled wide awake. The mules were whinnying nervously. He threw back the blanket and jumped to his feet, drawing his long white man knife from the bundle of his clothes. He strained his eyes and ears, staring and listening into the darkness of the wood. His sudden movement had woken Kat as well. She looked left and right for her spear, but could not find it in the gloom. So instead she crawled to the fire, threw the remaining kindling into the embers, and blew into them until a bright straw fire pushed back the darkness. She startled when she saw a humanoid figure at the edge of the light, but now she could also make out her spear leaning against a tree. She jumped to grab it, then rushed to join Heinrich by his side to face whatever was attacking them. A fur-clad native stepped into the light of the fire, showing his empty hands in a placating gesture, his white teeth showing in a bashful smile through his thick beard. It was the leader of the group that Heinrich had spoken to days before. The white man relaxed and laid a hand on Kat's leading hand, signaling her to lower her weapon. I don't think he means us harm, he explained. The native took a step closer and started talking in a guttural language, gesticulating animately with both hands. What is he saying? Kat asked, raising an eyebrow. Heinrich nodded, returned the man's smile, and rubbed his chin in thought, trying to make out his meaning. I think he's apologizing for disturbing us, he translated, and congratulating me for my luck with women. Kat looked at Heinrich and the bearded man in turn, then rolled her eyes and turned back to camp to put on her clothes. The white man waved for the other man to join them at the fire and got his pants thrown into his face when he leaned down to put his knife back. Eventually, they were partially dressed, the fire was burning once more, and they offered some leftover meat to their guest. The man accepted gladly and quickly wolfed down the food. Once more they shared a drink and began the cumbersome process of communication with gestures and few words they had picked up from each other. Heinrich did his best to translate for the mercenary, but she quickly caught on to what was being discussed and joined in the conversation. The man told them that he had spotted the smoke from their fire and went to investigate. When he arrived, they were in the middle of love-making, so he waited for them to finish before he approached. He and his people had decided to finally brave the Wurd, rather than face the misty nothingness that would search for the rich hunting grounds that Heinrich had told them about. But what had prompted their exodus from this world struck the two companions with grave concern. In fearful gestures, the chieftain told them that they had seen ghostly lights over the lone hill. Not the warm light and smoke of fires, but a cold luminescence from the sky. When the man left to rejoin his tribe and journey deeper into the woods, Heinrich and Kat had to decide what they were to do about this news. "That hill is an ancient place. Maybe it's haunted. We have to return as fast as possible," Kat urged. Heinrich nodded. "Yeah, but there's not much point traveling in the dark. Let's rest up while we still can, then set out with the first light."